The sun hung low over a dusty village, the light turning the horizon into a thread of molten gold. It was the kind of light that photographers chase across continents, the kind that makes ordinary Earth look like something out of a dream. But for the man crouching in the shade of a massive baobab tree, knees drawn to his chest, the beauty went largely unnoticed. He sat there, listening to the hush of cicadas as they called out their eternal summer song. Listening to the distant murmur of a village market, where voices rose and fell in patterns of bargaining and laughter. Listening, most of all, to the silence inside himself. His name was Jiwoo. And he was famous. Famous in the way that makes privacy a luxury and solitude an impossibility. His face had traveled through millions of headphones and screens, his voice pulsing through speakers with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Teenagers knew every word to his songs. Adults hummed his melodies without realizing it. His image adorned billboards in Seoul, Tokyo, Los Angeles, and London. But when the world demanded more, Jiwoo found himself hollow. His voice, once powerful and clear, now breathed shallowly. His thoughts, once focused and sharp, scattered like leaves in a storm. He had learned, over the years of constant performance, to wear a smile like armor. It was a practiced tilt of the lips, carefully calibrated to look genuine in photographs, convincing in interviews. But it never quite reached his eyes. Burnout had crept in slowly, like winter frost forming on a window. At first, it was just a little fatigue after a long tour. Then the exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure. Then the numbness, that terrible, creeping numbness that whispered in the dark hours of the morning, "You are not you anymore." The ache had sharpened over time, traveling from his shoulders down through his arms to his fingertips. Sometimes his hands shook when he tried to hold a microphone. Sometimes his voice cracked mid-note, not from lack of skill but from the weight of performing a version of himself that no longer felt real. So he came to Africa. Not to conquer, not to perform, not to be seen. He came to breathe. He came seeking the simplest, most radical thing he could imagine: quiet days and ordinary conversations. The kind that did not require rehearsed lines or staged reactions. The kind where you could pause mid-sentence and nobody would edit it out later. A local guide, someone who specialized in helping people disappear when they needed to, had arranged shelter in this village. It was small, unnamed in most guidebooks. Here, the pace of life was unpunctuated by schedules and alarms. Here, time moved differently. Jiwoo took a deep breath, letting the dry, warm air fill his lungs. For the first time in months, he felt the beginning of something that might eventually become peace. Her name was Mara, and she moved through the village with the ease of someone who had learned to listen to the wind before she spoke. Her name meant hope, though she rarely thought of herself that way. To her, she was simply Mara, the girl who ran the small shop by the market square, who wove baskets with her grandmother's patterns, who told stories to customers who wandered in the cool shade to hear her voice. Mara's hands carried the rhythm of routine. Folding cloth with precise corners. Arranging spices in their clay bowls, making sure the colors created a pleasing gradient: red paprika, golden turmeric, deep brown cinnamon. Tracing the pattern of a stray bead back into a necklace, her fingers moving with the certainty of someone who had performed the action 1,000 times. But it was her eyes that people remembered. They carried a light that came from having survived small storms. A missed bus that meant walking home in the rain. A late harvest that meant careful rationing through the lean months. A family member far away, letters arriving less and less frequently until they stopped altogether. She wore simple clothes, a wrap skirt in faded indigo, a cotton blouse embroidered at the collar by her younger sister, a necklace of seeds around her neck that her grandmother had strung when Mara was just a child. Her smile felt like shelter on a stormy night, the kind of smile that made people want to tell her their secrets. On the morning that would change everything, Mara woke before dawn, as she always did. She lit a small fire to warm water for washing. She plaited her hair in 2 neat braids. She said a quiet prayer, not to any specific deity, but to the day itself, asking it to be gentle. Then she walked to her shop, unlocked the wooden door with its rusty hinges, and began the familiar work of opening for the day. Sweeping the floor. Dusting the shelves. Arranging the new baskets her grandmother had finished the night before. She did not know, as she worked in the blue-gray light of early morning, that a man was arriving in the village that very day. A man who would see her not as a shopkeeper or a storyteller, but as someone who might teach him how to be human again. Jiwoo arrived with careful quietness, stepping away from the glare of cameras and the chorus of fans. He had left behind his stylist, his manager, and his security team. He traveled with only a small backpack, wearing ordinary clothes that made him look like any other traveler, faded jeans, a plain white t-shirt, sunglasses that hid his famous eyes. The guide had arranged a modest room for him above a bakery. When Jiwoo woke on his first morning, it was the scent of bread rising, that yeasty, warm smell that makes you feel safe even before you're fully awake. He opened his eyes to see flour dust drifting through a beam of sunlight, settling on his exposed arm like fine snow. He dressed slowly, savoring the lack of urgency. No schedule today. No choreography to remember. No interviews where he had to be charming for precisely 7 minutes and 30 seconds. He learned, in those first few days, to drink water from a clay cup that held the coolness of earth. To walk through the village without someone shouting his name. To sit on benches in the shade and watch life unfold around him, children playing with a worn soccer ball, women balancing baskets on their heads with impossible grace, old men playing board games with stones and bottle caps. He made a point of not drawing attention to himself. He started to notice things he hadn't seen in a long time. The way the morning light made everything look new and forgiving. The sound of laughter that wasn't performed for a camera. The taste of food that was just food, not a carefully curated dining experience, but sustenance made with care by people who knew how to coax flavor from simple ingredients. In Seoul, Jiwoo had been surrounded by millions of people and felt utterly alone. Here, in a village of perhaps 200, he began to feel the first stirrings of connection. On his 5th morning in the village, Jiwoo sat on a bench near the market square, pretending to read a book. He wasn't really reading it, the words swam on the page without meaning. But the book gave him something to do with his hands, a reason to sit still and observe without seeming to stare. That's when he saw her. Mara needed to fetch water from a well near the edge of the market. It was part of her morning routine: fill 2 large containers, carry them back to the shop, use the water for washing and to spray the ground around her before sweeping to reduce dust. As she approached the well, a sudden wind whipped across the square, stirring dust into a rising swirl. Mara paused, closing her eyes against the grit, one hand rising instinctively to protect her face. Jiwoo saw her stop. Without thinking, without the careful calculation that usually preceded his every public action, he rose from the bench. He moved toward her, to help her. "Are you all right?" he asked in English, then tried again in his halting Swahili, the few phrases he'd been practicing. Mara opened her eyes, blinking dust from her lashes. She looked at him, really looked, and he felt something shift in his chest. Not attraction, not yet. But recognition of some kind. The sense that this person saw him as a person, not as an image or an idea. She offered a nod that carried neither humor nor judgment, only the practical poise of someone who has learned to navigate crowded spaces with patience. "I'm fine," she said in English, her accent musical and warm. "The wind just likes to play tricks." They stood there for a moment, the dust settling around them. Then she smiled, and it was like watching a door open in a room you thought was locked. "I'm Mara," she said, extending her hand. "Jiwoo," he replied, taking it. Her palm was calloused from work. And that's how it began. With dust and wind and a handshake that felt like a promise neither of them knew they were making. They spoke in a language they shared without effort, a mixture of English, gestures, and that universal grammar of tone and expression that transcends words. Mara's questions were simple, practical, and gently probing. "Where are you from? What brings you here? How do you find your way around?" Questions that anyone might ask a stranger, but she asked them with genuine curiosity, leaning in slightly as she listened to his answers. Jiwoo surprised himself with the steadiness of his voice. He told her he was from Seoul, though he didn't mention he was famous there. He told her he needed a break from his work, though he didn't specify what that work was. He told her the village felt peaceful, and he liked the sound of the market in the morning. All of this was true. And the relief of speaking simple truths, without calculation or performance, made his shoulders drop from where they'd been hunched near his ears. They built their conversation brick by brick, starting with weather and bread and the color of the sky at dusk. Mara told him about the bakery below his room, how the owner had been baking there for 30 years. She told him about the best time to visit the market, when the vegetables were freshest and the vendors were in good moods. Jiwoo learned her name and its meaning. "Hope," he repeated softly, testing the word. "That's beautiful." Mara shrugged, but he caught the pleased curve of her lips. "My mother chose it. She said every child should carry a promise into the world." She spoke of her grandmother who had braided stories into her hair when she was small, tales of ancestors and animals and the river that flowed behind the village. She spoke of a neighbor who kept a garden of herbs that smelled of lemon and rain, rosemary and thyme and something else she couldn't name in English. She spoke of a festival that happened every year, a celebration that stitched the town together even in lean years, when money was tight and the harvest was small. Jiwoo listened with an attention he hadn't given anything in months. He noticed the small tremor in her breath when she mentioned her mother. He noticed the way her lips curved when she remembered a moment of childhood joy, her eyes going distant and soft. He noticed the way she gestured when she couldn't find the right word, her hands painting pictures in the air. He found himself wanting to know everything. Not to possess her story or use it somehow, but simply because knowing her felt like learning a language he'd forgotten he once spoke, the language of genuine human connection. Jiwoo's life, once a map of carefully planned appearances and strategic moments, began to dissolve into something more porous and more real. He started meeting Mara regularly. He'd time his morning walk to pass by the well. He'd find reasons to stop by her shop, needing advice on which fabric would make a good gift for someone back home, which basket was sturdy enough to carry books. Mara welcomed him with easy warmth. She'd pour him tea from a dented kettle, serve it in small cups without handles, sweet and strong with cardamom. They'd sit on stools in her shop while she worked, her hands never still, and talk about everything and nothing. He learned to notice the way the sun hit banana leaves at different times of day, how the light transformed them from dark green to almost translucent gold. He learned the exact shade of terracotta that painted her shop at noon, a color like red clay mixed with sunlight. He learned the way the market's rhythm shifted with the wind, bustling and loud when the air was still, quieter and more intimate when breezes brought the promise of rain. Mara was not a mirror reflecting Jiwoo's glory. She knew nothing of his fame, his sold-out concerts, his face on magazine covers. To her, he was simply Jiwoo, a quiet man from Seoul who seemed a little sad and a little lost, but always kind to her. She was a person with her own weather, her own secrets, her own small rituals that gave her days structure and meaning. Every morning, she said thank you to the day. Every evening, she wrote in a journal brief sentences capturing the day's events. Every Sunday, she walked to the river and sat on its banks, watching the water flow, letting it carry away the week's problems. Jiwoo felt something in him beginning to heal. The hollow feeling started to fill, slowly, like a well that's been dry too long and finally feels the first trickle of water returning. Jiwoo and Mara traded stories across the space of a few steps. They'd walk along dirt paths that wound through fields, measuring the world with their footprints, leaving tracks in red earth that would be washed away by the next rain. They'd share coffee made from beans roasted that morning by a vendor who sat under a blue tarp in the market, grinding by hand, the bittersweet smell drifting across the square. The coffee was strong enough to make your eyes water, served in tiny cups with enough sugar to make your teeth ache, perfect. Late evening talks became their favorite time. After the market closed and the village grew quiet, they'd find a place to sit, on the steps of her shop, or on the bench near the baobab where he'd first arrived, or sometimes just on the ground, backs against the wall of a building, watching stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. Jiwoo spoke of burnout, but not as a battle he was fighting. More as a fog that had surrounded him, thick and disorienting, making it impossible to see where he was or where he was going. I forgot who I was, he told her one night. Or maybe I never knew. Maybe I've been playing a character for so long that I don't know what's real anymore. Mara listened without judgment, without trying to fix him. She just listened, the way she listened to the wind or the river, with complete attention, allowing space for whatever needed to be said. She spoke when it was her turn to speak. She told him about her grandmother who taught her to sing to the river so it would guide the fish home, a gentle song in a language Mara only half understood. She told him about her sister who believed in the power of small acts of kindness to change a life, leaving a flower on a neighbor's doorstep, offering to carry a heavy load, sharing food when you had enough. We can't always control what happens, Mara said, her voice soft in the darkness. But we can control how we meet it. With anger or with grace. With bitterness or with hope. Jiwoo repeated her name over in his mind. Hope. She wore it well. Their relationship bloomed like a rare flower that prefers shade, slow and certain, away from harsh light. It grew in stolen moments that didn't feel stolen because neither of them was taking something forbidden. They were simply being present, together, allowing what wanted to grow to grow. A hand brushing against a wrist as they both reached for the same mango at the market, fingers touching for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. A shared umbrella against a sudden rain, standing close beneath it, feeling the warmth of another body, the rhythm of another breath. A seat by a fire one cool evening, where Mara stirred a pot of stew, vegetables and beans and spices that filled the air with fragrance, and Jiwoo offered to chop more vegetables. She handed him a knife and a cutting board, and they worked in companionable silence. The act of caring became a language you could feel in your bones. They learned each other's rhythms. His slow, measured breathing that steadied when he felt overwhelmed by memories of crowds and demands. Her careful, generous laughter that could dissolve a tense moment like salt in water. He noticed everything about her. The way she rubbed the back of her neck when she was tired. The way she hummed while she worked, melodies he didn't recognize but found himself trying to remember. The way she looked at him sometimes, openly and without expectation, as if to say, "I see you, and what I see is good." She noticed everything about him. The way his jaw tightened when someone in the market got too loud, too close. The way he watched children playing, his eyes going soft with something like longing. The way he tilted his head when he was really listening, giving his whole attention as if the words she spoke were the most important thing in the world. Neither of them said "I love you." Not yet. The words felt too big, too heavy with expectation. Instead, they showed it. In the way he brought her grandmother flowers from a field on the edge of the village. In the way she set aside the best fruit from the market for him. In the way they sat together in comfortable silence, not needing to fill every moment with words. Love, they were learning, could be quiet. Could be patient. Could grow in the spaces between words, in the rhythm of ordinary days lived together. Yet the world outside remained a constant presence, a reminder that identity can be tied to the audience that consumes it. Jiwoo wrestled with a question he did not voice, even to Mara: would anyone believe his honesty if he allowed people to see the fatigue behind the smile? Would his fans accept a version of him that was tired, uncertain, sometimes afraid? Or would they turn away, disappointed that their idol was only human after all? He had built a career on being perfect. On never letting the mask slip. On always being camera ready, always performing, always on. The thought of revealing weakness terrified him in a way that stage fright never had. Mara's presence, grounded and unwavering, made him confront uncomfortable truths. That healing wasn't about erasing the past or pretending the burnout hadn't happened. It was about choosing a path forward that honored all of it, the success and the breakdown, the joy and the exhaustion, the public persona and the private self. With her, he tasted mornings without pressure. He woke when his body was ready, not when an alarm screamed. He ate breakfast slowly, savoring each bite instead of swallowing food without tasting it while rushing to the next appointment. But the fear remained. The knowledge that this peace was fragile, that the world he'd left behind wouldn't forget him just because he needed to breathe. The crisis arrived in the form of a rumor, a whisper that traveled across the village like a gust of wind, gaining speed as it moved. Someone had recognized him. Or thought they had. A tourist passing through had taken a photo, blurry, indistinct, but enough to spark curiosity online. Was that K-pop idol Jiwoo in a small African village? The speculation spread quickly, the way these things do in the age of instant communication. A journalist, chasing the narrative of a hidden celebrity, pursued the lead. She arrived in the village asking questions, showing people a photo on her phone. "Have you seen this man?" Jiwoo felt the walls closing in. He stood at a crossroads, literally and figuratively. He could retreat further into anonymity, maybe leave the village entirely, move to somewhere even more remote. Protect the fragile peace he'd found by running again. Or he could stay. Reveal a piece of his truth. Risk everything. Mara sensed the tension before he said a word. She knew him well enough now to read the signs, the way he carried weight in his shoulders when something was wrong, the way his smile stopped reaching his eyes, the way he touched his neck as if checking that he could still breathe. Something happened, she said. Not a question. They were sitting in her shop after closing time, the market square empty and quiet outside. Jiwoo looked at his hands, these hands that had signed so many autographs, held so many microphones, waved to so many crowds. Someone might have recognized me, he said quietly. There's a journalist asking around. Mara waited for him to explain. So he told her. Not everything, that would take hours, but enough. He told her he was a singer, well known in Korea and other countries. That he'd been famous since he was young, that he'd spent half his life performing. That the pressure had become too much, that he'd needed to disappear for a while to remember how to be human. I should have told you earlier, he said, unable to meet her eyes. I'm sorry. Mara was quiet for a long moment. Jiwoo's heart hammered against his ribs. She would be angry, he thought. Angry that he'd lied by omission, that he'd let her believe he was just an ordinary traveler. But when she spoke, her voice was steady. You came here to heal. That's what you told me. Everything else, the fame, the crowds, that's just context. It doesn't change who you are right now, sitting here with me. Jiwoo looked up, hardly daring to hope. But, Mara continued, you have to decide what you want. You can keep running, keep hiding. Or you can face it. And whatever you decide, I'm here. It wasn't permission to stay or an order to leave. It was an offering of choice, of courage. She was telling him that he had the power to decide how to guard what mattered most, his humanity, his peace, his right to exist as more than a silhouette on a screen. They chose to face it together. Jiwoo agreed to meet with the journalist, but on his terms. In the village, not in Seoul. In a quiet place, not in front of cameras. And with Mara beside him, if she was willing. She was willing. They met in the shade of the baobab tree where his story in this village had begun. The journalist arrived with a small recording device, her expression curious but not hostile. Jiwoo spoke with a measured honesty that surprised him. The words came easier than he expected, maybe because he wasn't alone, maybe because he'd spent weeks practicing simple truths with Mara. He admitted that fame had taxed him, that success had come with a price he hadn't fully understood when he was younger. He talked about the pressure to be perfect, to never show weakness, to always be on. He explained that he'd looked for refuge in many places, therapy, medication, isolation, but none of them had truly worked because they all happened while he was still trapped in the machine of celebrity. I came here not to hide, he said, but to find out who I am when no one's watching. And what I found. He glanced at Mara, who sat quietly beside him, her presence a steady anchor. What I found is that I'm more than the image people have of me. I'm allowed to be tired. I'm allowed to need rest. I'm allowed to be human. The journalist listened, taking notes but mostly just listening. When Jiwoo finished, she asked if she could publish his words. He thought about it. Then nodded. Yes. But not because I want attention. Because maybe someone else out there is burning out too. Maybe someone needs to hear that it's okay to stop, to step away, to choose yourself. Mara reached over and took his hand. The journalist noticed but didn't comment, though her eyes softened. When the interview was done and the journalist had left, Jiwoo and Mara sat together in the fading light. He felt lighter somehow, as if speaking the truth had released something that had been pressing against his chest for years. "Thank you," he said to Mara. "For what?" "For staying. For not running when you found out who I am." The village, as it turned out, already knew. Or suspected. Word travels fast in small communities. But they had chosen to protect him anyway, to let him be just another person walking their streets. And when the story was published, a thoughtful piece about burnout and celebrity and the human need for authentic connection, the villagers didn't treat Jiwoo any differently. They still greeted him in the morning. They still invited him to sit and share tea. That, more than anything, convinced Jiwoo he'd made the right choice in staying. In the days and weeks that followed, Jiwoo and Mara walked through markets together, as two people who had learned to see each other clearly, without the distortion of fame or the pressure of perfection. He helped in her shop, labeling baskets, listening to customers' stories, learning to laugh without a script or a plan. She accompanied him on a short trek to a nearby hill, a walk of several hours through countryside that smelled of dust and wild flowers. At the top, they watched a sunset spill its colors across the earth and sky, orange and pink and purple and gold, the kind of beauty that makes you understand why people have always looked to the heavens for meaning. Jiwoo spoke of feelings he'd suppressed for years. "I was afraid," he admitted, "that if I stopped being perfect, no one would love me anymore. That I was only valuable as long as I could perform." Mara listened, her hand in his. "That's not love," she said gently. "That's transaction. Love doesn't require perfection. It requires presence." He thought about that for a long time, watching the sun sink below the horizon. "You're right," he said finally. "You're right." Mara spoke too, about belonging. About how for a long time after her mother died, she'd felt unmoored, like a boat without an anchor. She told him about a neighbor who had helped her family after her mother's death, bringing food and staying to tell stories, refusing to let them sink into grief alone. Mara said. "She just showed up. Every day. That's what taught me that love is a practice, not a feeling." The bond between them deepened through ordinary acts that mattered more than grand gestures ever could. They repaired a fence together, Jiwoo learning to hammer nails straight, Mara teaching him with patient humor. They painted a mural on the wall of her shop, a river winding through grass, the water painted in blues and whites that seemed to shimmer when the light hit them right. They kept a promise to visit the well together each week. When Jiwoo performed songs in the village square, not for fans but for the people who had welcomed him, who had given him space to heal, Mara stood in the crowd with a steady smile. She watched him sing, his voice strong and clear in a way it hadn't been in months, and understood that art could heal when it came from a place of honesty rather than obligation. After the performance, an old man from the village approached Jiwoo. "Your voice is very beautiful," he said. "But you know what's more beautiful? The way you look at that girl. Like she's the song you've been trying to write your whole life." Jiwoo laughed, but the old man was right. Mara had become his anchor, his home, his reminder that he was more than the sum of his accomplishments or failures. Seasons shifted, turning the landscape into a mosaic of gold, crimson, and green. The dry season gave way to rains that drummed on roofs and turned the red earth to mud. Then the rains passed and the dry heat returned, baking everything under a sun that felt close enough to touch. Through it all, Jiwoo and Mara's relationship grew and deepened, adapting to weather both literal and metaphorical. Jiwoo began to rebuild something he'd almost forgotten existed, a sense of self that was not dictated by external approval. He learned to measure success not by album sales or concert attendance, but by quieter metrics. The quality of his sleep, the steadiness of his heartbeat, the ease of his laughter. Most of all, he measured it by the quiet joy in Mara's eyes when he arrived at her shop in the morning, by the way she pressed a warm hand to his when the night grew cold, by the gentleness she offered when his voice trembled mid-note, when old fears threatened to overwhelm him. In return, he offered her steadiness when the village grew noisy with gossip or when personal fears crept in. When her grandmother fell ill, he sat with Mara through long nights at her bedside, saying little but present, always present. When the shop's roof began to leak during the rains, he helped organize repairs, learning practical skills he'd never needed in his previous life of hotels and limousines. He became part of the village's fabric in a way he'd never been part of any community. Not as a star visiting from above, but as a thread woven in, essential to the pattern. One evening, Mara's grandmother, recovered from her illness, called Jiwoo over. She was a small woman with hands gnarled from decades of work, eyes that missed nothing. "You're good for her," she said simply. "And she's good for you." "That's rare." "Don't forget it." "I won't," Jiwoo promised. The old woman nodded. "Love is not just a feeling," she said, echoing words her granddaughter had once spoken. "It's a choice you make every day. Choose well, and it will sustain you through everything." Jiwoo thought about the choices he'd made, to come to this village, to let himself be vulnerable with Mara, to speak his truth even when it was frightening. Each choice had led to the next, creating a path he could look back on with something like pride. One night, after a festival that invited the entire village to celebrate the harvest, Jiwoo and Mara returned to the spot beneath the baobab where their story had, in a sense, begun. The air carried the scent of ripe fruit and earth after rain, petrichor, that word for the smell of dust meeting water, ancient and new at once. Above them, the baobab's branches spread like the fingers of an enormous hand, sheltering them from the vast sky. They sat with their backs against the trunk, its bark rough and ancient against their shoulders. Around them, the sounds of the village settling for the night, children being called inside, cooking fires dying down, the last conversations of the day fading into comfortable silence. Jiwoo realized something that made his chest tighten with emotion. His most precious role was not on a stage in front of thousands. It was here, in this shared breath, in the soft weight of Mara's hand in his, in this quiet moment that no one would photograph or report on or remember except the two of them. "I was so lost," he said softly, surprising himself by speaking. "When I came here, I was so lost I couldn't even see it. I thought I just needed rest. But it was more than that. I needed to remember how to be a person." Mara turned to look at him, her face soft in the moonlight. "You taught me that," he continued. "You and this place. You taught me that my value doesn't come from what I produce or how many people know my name. It comes from showing up honestly. From being present. From choosing connection even when it's scary." He paused, gathering courage. "I love you. I love you for seeing me when I couldn't see myself. For offering patience when I didn't know how to ask for it. For showing me that healing is possible if you're brave enough to accept help. Mara smiled, and it was the smile he'd fallen in love with: shelter in a storm, warmth in cold darkness, hope made visible. I love you too, she said simply. Not because you're famous or talented or any of the things the world values. I love you because you're kind. Because you listen. Because you're trying every day to be better. That's all any of us can do. They sat in companionable silence, hands clasped, hearts beating their separate rhythms that somehow harmonized. Above them, stars wheeled in their ancient paths. Around them, the village breathed its collective breath. Between them, love, quiet, certain, real.